Hello everyone, my name is Bradley Barth and I'm a senior reporter with SE Magazine. Welcome to today's session titled Guccifer 2.0, the DNC hack and Fancy Bears, oh my, sponsored by ThreatConnect. On the heels of the Democratic National Committee data breach earlier this year, the DNC cybersecurity firm CrowdStrike pinned the blame on two Russia-based threat groups. However, a hacker with the alias Guccifer 2.0 subsequently claimed attribution for leaking party files and communications. Today's session will explain how through its own follow-up investigation, including analysis of metadata on Guccifer 2.0's released files, ThreatConnect made additional discoveries that cast doubt on the alleged hacker's story. The presentation will also address why this incident is not just a DNC problem and why other organizations should care. Our speaker today is Toni Gidwani. That's Toni Gidwani, Director of Research Operations at ThreatConnect, home to an elite group of globally acknowledged cybersecurity experts dedicated to tracking down existing and emerging cyber threats. Toni previously built and led analytic teams at the Defense Intelligence Agency and joined ThreatConnect from the Office of the Secretary of Defense. There will be a Q&A following the presentation, so I would encourage you to type in any questions for our speaker via the interface. And with that, I would now like to welcome in Toni. Hi, Toni. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Brad, for that introduction. Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us. Today we're going to discuss the breach of the Democratic National Committee, the case for Russian attribution, and the developments surrounding the Guccifer 2.0 persona who has been leaking these purported documents over the last month. Although Guccifer 2.0 claims to be an independent lone hacker, we'll discuss why that doesn't add up, both in terms of his claims of technical prowess and the persona he presents. We'll also lay out our assessment for why Guccifer 2.0 as a Russian fixture creates a pursuit of our objectives based on the technical links back to Russia and some good old-fashioned all-source analysis. As always, a story this complex requires many hands to make sense of. Our webinar today will take you through some of the forensic analysis published by our partners at CrowdStrike, reporting by journalists who have been steadily chipping away at Lucifer 2.0's inconsistencies over the last month, and a body of work by the ThreatConnect Research team. Our research can be found in a series of blog posts on the ThreatConnect website, as well as technical indicators we have shared in the ThreatConnect platform and our common community. Those are available to everyone with a free account, and we encourage you to come check it out, see the linkages, and explore the data for yourself. And if you're coming to Black Hat or DEF CON next week, come chat with us about it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. So we're going to start with the basics of the DNC breach and the forensic analysis CrowdStrike performed tying the breach to two distinct advanced persistent threat groups tied to Russia. Story broke on June 15th when the Washington Post published an article describing the breach and CrowdStrike published their accompanying technical analysis. DNC leaders became aware that something was wrong in late April and called CrowdStrike in to investigate. Their incident response group immediately identified two sophisticated adversaries on the DNC network, known as Fancy Bear and Cozy Bear. CrowdStrike describes both of these actors as having excellent technical tradecraft and that they live off the land when they breach a network, which enables them to easily bypass many security solutions that they encounter. Both groups were constantly going back into the DNC environment to try to stay ahead of being detected. And they did this by changing out their implants, modifying persistent methods, and moving to new command and control channels. So this was not a smash and grab job. They came and they stayed for a long time. And attacks like this require a level of dedication, organization, and resourcing that tends to strongly correlate to a nation state being behind them. So these adversaries get named as their handiwork is encountered and technical patterns, sort of the types of malware that they use, the various attack vectors start to emerge across different attacks. So both Fancy Bear and Cozy Bear engage in extensive political and economic espionage and are thought to be very closely linked to distinct Russian intelligence services. And so it's one of the things that's interesting about the DNC breach is that here you have two competing intelligence agencies separately breaching the DNC. And as far from the forensic analysis, it didn't appear that they had any idea that the other group was there. And espionage targeting presidential campaigns in and of itself is not a new story. Understanding the motivations, the networks, the proclivities of the next leader of the United States is a high priority for other countries and always has been. And even in the digital realm, during the 2008 election, both the Obama and the McCain campaigns were targeted by China. But something interesting happened after the Washington Post article came out. A threat actor calling himself Guccifer 2.0 created a WordPress site and a Twitter handle and claimed credit for the breach, saying that it was not the Russians at all. So we're going to talk about Guccifer 2.0 at length later, but it seems suspicious right off the bat that this was a completely unknown entity and that he only came forward after the breach was publicized. So before we do that, we're going to dig in a little bit more to the bears. So we'll start with Fancy Bear, which is the nickname that CrowdStrike is given to the APT group suspected of being in association with the GRU, Russia's primary military intelligence service. There is no centralized naming system for these threat actors, and other information security companies call the same group by other names such as APT28 or Sophosy, a name derived from a family of malware that this group commonly uses. We're going to use Fancy Bear here since we're referencing CrowdStrike's analysis, and it means that I get to use a picture of a bear with a monocle and a bow tie in my briefing, and let's be honest, that's not something you get to do every day. Fancy Bear has been active since the mid-2000s and has targeted defense ministries and military victims extensively. It has been linked to intrusions into the German parliament, or Bundestag, and France's TV5 Mon station in April of 2015. It has a wide range of custom implants that it uses, including Sophosy, X-Agent, and X-Tunnel. These tools are not widely available. They're not commodity tools, and so seeing them deployed against a network is a strong indicator of Fancy Bear's fingerprints or paw prints, as opposed to some other threat actor. Fancy Bear often tries to gain access to networks by stealing their victims' credentials, and they do this by spoofing their web-based email services. That tactic is used by a number of threat actors, and although it's simple, they do it because it works. So Fancy Bear breached the DNC in April of 2016, right close to the time that DNC officials realized that something was amiss. In the breach, Fancy Bear deployed X-Agent malware with capabilities to do remote command execution, file transmission, and key logging. It was executed via run DLL32 commands. In addition, Fancy Bear's X-Tunnel network tunneling tool was also used to execute remote commands. So both tools were deployed via REMCOM, an open source replacement for PSExec available from GitHub, and they also engaged in a number of anti-forensic analysis measures, such as periodic event log clearing and resetting timestamps on files. Those measures are designed to cover an adversary's tracks when incident responders are trying to piece together the details of a breach. Next, take a look at Cozy Bear, also known as Cozy Duke or APT29 within the information security community. Cozy Bear successfully infiltrated the unclassified networks of the White House, the State Department, and the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff last year. But their targets are pretty wide-ranging and go well outside the U.S. government, and include organizations across the defense, energy, financial, and insurance industries, just to name a few. So as opposed to stealing email credentials via a webmail page, Cozy Bear prefers broadly targeted spearfish campaigns that typically include web links to a malicious dropper. Again, a tactic that is used because it works so well. Cozy Bear then uses a number of sophisticated remote access tools. These tools leverage extensive anti-analysis techniques to ensure that the sample is not being analyzed in a sandbox or on a virtual machine, i.e. by somebody who's trying to figure out what these tools do. They have extensive checks for security software that would be installed on their target system, and if a configuration exists that would cause problem for the tool, it will exit to avoid drawing attention. These types of tactics, techniques, and procedures are consistent with a very well-resourced adversary with a thorough testing regime. Their implants are highly configurable, which allows the adversary to customize various components, including the command and control servers that are used, and the list of initial tasks to carry out, and so on. So now turning specifically to the DNC breach, CrowdStrike assessed that Cozy Bear breached the DNC in the summer of 2015, so much sooner than Fancy Bear did. The intrusion relied primarily on the CDaddy implant developed in Python and another PowerShell backdoor with persistence accomplished via the Windows Management Instrumentation System, which allowed the adversary to launch malicious code automatically after a specified period of uptime or on a specific schedule. So CrowdStrike described that PowerShell backdoor as ingenious in its simplicity and power because it consisted of a single command set up to run persistently. Let's see, what else do we have here? PowerShell version of the credential tool Minicast was also used by the actors, and basically they were able to use this to, to steal credentials that would allow them to move around the DNC network. Again, another way that an adversary tries to avoid being detected, by building in duplication and other channels of control, not necessarily just the way they got in the first place. So when CrowdStrike published their assessment of the breach, we were very interested to dig into these indicators a little bit more and build upon, the really solid work that they had done. ThreatConnect shares analysis in our communities on these two actors, and we're always interested in figuring out, what the bears are up to. So the first thing we did was share out those indicators that CrowdStrike released, so that they would be available in a structured fashion. And then we went looking for additional infrastructure. When we did, we found something interesting about the first IP address that you can see, hopefully, in the slide image here. So using ThreatConnect's Farsight passive DNS integration to review the resolution history for this IP address, 45.32.129.185, we uncovered some additional domain resolutions. One of these domain resolutions is the suspicious domain misdepartment.com. But note the transposition of the T and the R in the department. So this site is spoofing a legitimate company called MIS Department. As it turns out, MIS Department is a technology services provider that lists a variety of clients on its website, one of which is the DNC. Their staff profiles include individuals who provide technical leadership and expertise in the past to the Obama-Biden campaigns, as well as to the DNC. So any attacker targeting a particular victim would do well to impersonate a site like this or an organization who would have administrative access across enterprise assets. So remember earlier I said Fancy Bear is known for its technique of registering domains that that closely resemble domains of legitimate organizations they plan to target. And so it looks like here that we have found another one of those. So next, we reviewed the domain who is information, and our domain tools integration revealed that this domain was registered on March 22nd, 2016 by Frank_Merdieu at Europe.com. So shortly before Fancy Bear breached the DNC in April 2016. I'm sorry, we seem to have a little bit of latency here in the slides. All right, so we return to passive DNS, which allows us to see which IP the domain has resolved to over time. And it's a really useful technique for researchers. And we see that on April 24th, the spoofed domain moved from a parking IP address to the Fancy Bear command and control IP address that we started with, at 45.32.129.185. So given that the suspicious domain came into existence and transitioned into an operational state on dates that align with the CrowdStrike timeline, as well as the clientele, if you will, of MIS Department, we conclude from this that Fancy Bear created and staged this MIS Department spoof as a means of indirectly gaining or maintaining access into the DNC's networks. All right, so let's regroup with what we've covered so far. The forensic evidence linking the DNC breach to those two known Russian APT operations is very, very strong. Not only, is CrowdStrike a very well-respected company in this sphere, but two competing cybersecurity companies, Mandiant and Fidelis, confirmed CrowdStrike's initial findings. So the forensic evidence that links the DNC breaches to these known groups is solid. We've got used and reused tools. We've got methods and infrastructure. So we're very confident that both of these threat actor groups did, in fact, breach the DNC. So then what of this Guccifer 2.0 character? He claims it wasn't the Russians, which the information security community did not find plausible based on everything that we've already discussed. But that doesn't necessarily preclude a third independent hacker from breaching the DNC, and due diligence requires that we examine that possibility. So this is a little bit here about how Guccifer 2.0 has described himself, obviously not with the meme, that's our handiwork. As I've already mentioned, Guccifer 2.0 emerged on the scene only after the DNC breach was reported by the Washington Post. His true name is unrevealed. He borrowed his handle from the jailed Romanian hacker Marcel Lehel, I'm not sure if that's how it's pronounced, who is currently awaiting trial here in Virginia. He claims no affiliation to either Fancy Bear or Cozy Bear or Russia in general. In his original statements, he was very antagonistic. He hated being attributed to the Russians, proclaimed himself as Romanian, and is among the best hackers in the world. So he claimed his purpose for breaching the DNC was to create a world free of the Illuminati, and that he'd hacked the DNC in summer of 2015. As I mentioned, he kind of emerged with that WordPress account and a Twitter handle, and then he published an initial dump of documents, 3 initial dumps of documents in the first week or two right after the Washington Post article came out. That included the DNC's opposition research into Donald Trump, a number of reports on donor data and things like that. So based on his, one other point I'll add here, based on his Twitter followers, the Guccifer persona seems to be crafted to be more of a supporter of Bernie Sanders than explicitly pro-Trump. But either way, he's trying to portray himself as an ideologically motivated hacker. Well, in a nutshell for us, this sounded made up. We have a supposed ideological hacker with no backstory, no web presence prior to mid-June, and there are lots of oddities about the first few batches of documents he released, including that Trump file and donor information. So all of the document file types that he initially released were actually within rich text format, which is a legacy, non-standard file format and really odd for an organization to consistently use. Then other researchers identified Russian language error messages and references to the founder of the KGB's predecessor organization, the Cheka, in some of these documents. Also pretty sure that the DNC didn't put those there. And then we've got issues with the timestamps. So the timestamps of these files don't match the timeline of events. So you can see here, and if you go to the blog, you'll see you can blow up this image in much more detail to look at the timeline. And across the top in the red, you've got the breach details and when they were released, and then a series of events, later where we map out when these files were created, when they were modified, and then when they were posted. So all of the documents that Guccifer 2.0 released in his first 2 batches had file creation dates from after when the Washington Post article was published, based on their metadata. Yet the files in the third batch had creation dates from July 2015, so much more consistent with his claim timeline, but less consistent with the other files. Another thing that stood out to us, many of the files have created and modified timestamps that cluster tightly together, some of them simultaneously. So to us, this suggested that an unknown application or process interacted with the files, or they were manually manipulated or time-stomped. And then there are also details, where you've got file names that have dates contained in them. Those dates don't match up to any of the metadata in the files that were dumped. Or some of the files have names like 1, 2, or 3. That would be illogical things for an organization to name and store files by. So all of these inconsistencies that we're starting to draw out here, and this is early on, we're still here within a week after the breach had been announced in June, make us question the integrity of these purported documents that are being released, and who this Lucifer 2.0 persona is and what their objective is, because the things that he's saying and doing do not add up, in the face of all of this evidence. So what we decided to do was an analysis of competing hypotheses. So this is an analytic technique that is used in the intelligence community when you've got differing hypotheses and a bunch of fragmentary pieces of evidence. So full-blown ACH would have required a lot more time and a lot more spreadsheets and charts. This was kind of a lighter touch version that we did. But basically what we did was to lay out the argument for our two working hypotheses, either that Guccifer 2.0 is an independent actor or is affiliated with the Russians, and then try and prove for and against each of those. So basically that becomes a quad chart. And the strength of this is that you're trying to tease out the evidence in a way that gives you the best feel for which of these situations are, and that helps you minimize your bias towards the evidence. And one of the outcomes of this process, sort of the way they teach us is, you can find evidence for a hypothesis, and that's great, but it's more compelling if you're able to disprove a hypothesis. So what we really want to be able to do coming out of this exercise is to say with confidence that Guccifer 2.0, is not an independent actor, or Guccifer 2.0 is not a Russian denial and deception campaign. And to do this, within our team, we basically had different researchers craft the argument, for one of those four scenarios, so that we didn't have people trying to argue against themselves, and they could really focus on making the strongest argument they could, depending on what part of the quad chart they were in. So we're going to walk through that here. So we started by trying to make the best case we could that Guccifer 2.0 is in fact an independent actor. And so if this was the case, we walked through some of those inconsistencies we had talked about earlier, and this is what we came up with, that CrowdStrike's report disrupted Guccifer 2.0's desired timing. This adversary had been seeking significant social impact, was hoping to procure additional documents, and so was continuing to loiter on the DNC's website, network, and that Guccifer 2.0's intention would have been to release closer to the election to have the greatest possible impact, and that plan was disrupted when CrowdStrike made their assessment and the story went public. Similarly, the low social media profile associated with the Guccifer 2.0 persona is a reflection of operational security, that this actor is trying to minimize openly available intelligence on himself, and again went on the offensive after that CrowdStrike report and created new accounts, and so that's why there's no backstory here. Both in terms of, I guess, if you would, the digital footprint, but even in his FAQ or interactions with journalists, Guccifer 2.0 has been very non-committal about any other hacks that he has perpetrated. And then the third point, that those timestamp inconsistencies aren't necessarily a big deal. The argument for that would be that the compromised documents were saved, in a secure offline storage medium, not locally on Guccifer 2.0's computer, in case he was investigated or arrested. And so in that case, Guccifer 2.0 might only have immediate access to any documents that he was using as part of follow-on operations. And that might be why those documents were altered. So I have to say, we conducted this analysis before the large WikiLeaks dump that was revealed over the weekend. So at this point, we don't know if that huge batch of documents, if the same problems with timestamping or alteration that we saw in the early releases are also present. So it's worth noting here that our entire argument for this 4 hypothesis is basically built on our own logic, but not any evidence that we can cite or reference from any other party than Guccifer 2.0's own statements. All right, so now the case against Guccifer 2.0 being an independent actor. One of the first things that we came up with, and we really struggled again, was the questionable integrity of the leaked documents. Like, why do this? If your purpose is political in nature, to expose the Illuminati and to bring down the powerful, you really want people focused on the content of the documents you're leaking, not these inconsistencies about metadata and file creation dates. And it seemed odd to us, that Guccifer would have been a much more compelling actor if he had breached and had the original documents, if he had released the original documents. Another thing that we really struggled with here was that Guccifer 2.0's actions are very atypical of an ideologically driven that's a good one, or hacktivist behaviors. So typically the profile for these threat actors is that they don't stay quiet for long. They're politically motivated, they seek publicity, they share their documents quickly. For a hacktivist to have gained access, summer of 2015 and waited almost an entire calendar year really seems out of sync with the profile and easily would have led to the threat actor getting scooped, which is in this case what happened. That CrowdStrike came out and said that this was the Russians before Guccifer 2.0 would have gotten to drop that bomb himself. But then there were also a lot of other inconsistencies that, the more Guccifer 2.0 interacted with journalists and published different posts, the story just continued to get more and more implausible. So between his posts and his statements and interviews, Guccifer 2.0's version of the DNC breach goes something like this. He breached the DNC in the summer of 2015 using a zero-day exploit for NGP Van Vote Builder, and that's an internet-based software platform that the DNC uses. He claimed that he modified commodity tools that he purchased in a black market forum and then exploited a bug in that NGP Van software that at one point gave the Bernie Sanders campaign additional unauthorized access to information collected by other campaigns. So none of this really makes any sense, and we'll walk through why. So let's start with that zero-day exploit for NGP Van. Stable, unknown, and unpatched vulnerabilities are subject to the laws of supply and demand. They fetch top dollar on the underground because few people can identify and productize them. Again, this doesn't seem to fit the profile. If you were going to develop a zero-day, most hackers would focus on a broadly adopted, ubiquitous technology that would allow them to fetch maximum dollar for the longest period of time. So creating a zero-day for a niche voter organization software is a very costly approach for an attacker. And again, remember the way that the methods that CrowdStrike is attributed to our two very sophisticated Russian state actors were much simpler to get in the door. Harvest email credentials and encourage users to click on a malicious link. Those are much easier ways to get into the door of a target organization than to craft a really, really niche, difficult to find commodity exploit. Yet he claimed he identified the zero-day vulnerability, or fuzzed, NGP Van Vote Builder with his skill set, and then tools like IDA Pro and WinDBG, which we find simply impossible. The software, NGP-Van Vote Builder, is a multi-tenant cloud software as a service solution. So there is no local binary to fuzz, disassemble, or debug. So you have a misalignment here between the tools that Guccifer 2.0 is naming and the target he claims to be using them against. A vulnerability developer would use these programs to identify why a particular program crashed so they could begin to understand and develop an exploit. But there are really much better solutions for this, and somebody with his purported skill set should have the skill set to be able to do that. So moreover, like I said, there was no local binary. So to fuzz the NGP-Van Vote Builder system, Guccifer 2.0 would have had to do it from the inside out as an authenticated user to the web service, or remotely from the outside in. But either of these approaches wouldn't use the tools that he's mentioned. Both of those approaches would also be extremely invasive and much more likely to generate a significant amount of log activity and or errors that would draw unwanted attention to his efforts. Okay, and then he said that he compromised that bug. That's also difficult to explain. So NGP-Van's blog post when they announced it alluded to a permissions bug that allowed unauthorized read-only access to additional data within campaigns that an authorized user may not have permissions to view. But that bug did not exist until December 16th, 2015, when NGP-Van updated the Vote Builder platform in production. So the bug was described as temporary, but created a politically charged firestorm of media attention, as well as a lot of extra focus, auditing and log review from NGP-Van. And as you might have guessed, sort of the histrionics surrounding that catalyzed NGP-Van to issue a patch very, very quickly. So somehow Guccifer 2.0 exploited a bug that didn't exist for another 5 months. And here we thought that only Chuck Norris can exploit a vulnerability for software that hasn't been coded yet. If this is the case, well, Chuck's got some competition. But additionally, exploiting this vulnerability would not have given Guccifer 2.0 the access needed to compromise the DNC network as he claimed. Again, the vulnerability existed in a multi-tenant, internet-based software as a service platform, so not a local service that would be installed on DNC computer systems. So this bug would not allow access to the platform's underlying operating system or its user's computer system, or allow a threat actor to install malicious software on machines accessing the Vote Builder platform. So the way he's describing his attack here just doesn't make any sense. So the next, sort of growing body of inconsistencies are about, the way Guccifer 2.0 talks. The statements in the vernacular that are used in his interviews and in his statements. This has been documented and commented on a lot by journalists, particularly at Vice in their motherboard column. They did some really, really great work showing sort of the history of their chats with Guccifer 2.0, which they posted, and then a linguistic analysis talking sort of about the pattern of English and Romanian usage in the course of that interview. It's really fascinating, and worth the read. So a lot of issues come out with this Romanian backstory, even from the beginning when Guccifer 2.0 starts to interact with journalists. It's clear that he doesn't speak the language very well. He seems way more familiar with the intricacies of U.S. politics, not just this election cycle, but he's releasing documents pertaining to campaign finance scandals from 5, 6, 7 years ago. As opposed to some of the statements he makes about Romania and Russia. There's also the inconsistencies the way he talks about Russia. As I mentioned before, when in his early statements, he's very anti-Russian, doesn't want to be attributed to Russia, but becomes much more laudatory of Russian hacking abilities in later interviews with journalists. He also makes claims, the way he talks about technical terms doesn't really match up with the way technical experts talk. In his FAQ, he says, finding a 0-day only seems difficult. But for a really good specialist armed with skills and fuzzing, and then again, he mentions these tools, it's just a matter of time. And this really serves as an awkward record scratch for those tuned into the world of vulnerabilities and exploits. A technical expert, simply wouldn't reply like this. A statement like that at a security conference would get you, pelted with schmoo balls. The response oversimplifies skills and needlessly raises the name of specific tools. True vulnerability developers who create 0 days know how to manipulate software and hardware at a very low level and would speak instead to skill sets such as the knowledge around memory and how to corrupt and control it. And similarly, uses this phrase Trojan-like virus, what he created in his compromise with the DNC. Again, Trojans and viruses are two different things, with their differences primarily rooted in functionality around replication. Viruses are synonymous with infecting documents, and the propagation vector relies on unassuming users to replicate the malware. This is a phrase that you don't hear subject matter experts, use. All right. So at this point, we're pretty comfortable, and we think the evidence continues to prove that Guccifer 2.0 is not who he says he is. But let's go and look and see if our second hypothesis, for Guccifer 2.0 being a denial and deception campaign, if that holds water. So we started again by laying out the arguments for. And when we looked at that, we found some interesting things. One, namely, that there's precedent and doctrine for the Russians doing this. You have the example after the TV5 Mon hack from last year, where again a disposable persona, this cyber caliphate, came online to claim responsibility. And in this case, the cyber caliphate used the same command and control infrastructure as Fancy Bear, so that didn't really hold water. But you have there, the demonstrated attempt to do that. And then if you look at the way, if you read Russian doctrine on information operations, this type of, full-scale activity is broadly consistent. And there is a pattern that you see through, particularly if you look at Russian actions in Eastern Europe and Ukraine, that sort of established the intellectual grounding for why the Russians might do this. And then we looked at some, when we looked at some of those pieces of evidence, they looked like clues that might be purposely left behind. References to the KGB founder, the founder of the KGB's predecessor organization, those Russian language traces, in an attempt to make Guccifer 2.0 seem legitimate. It's just they were not well-placed breadcrumbs. When we looked at those inconsistencies in the leak backstory, to us that seemed like evidence of haste. So that maybe, Guccifer 2.0 was not part of the original plan, that the original operation was espionage, to breach and exfiltrate documents from the DNC. And it's kind of embarrassing to have that outed so publicly, and on top of that, to make it look like you have two intelligence agencies that got caught because they failed to coordinate in breaching a target. And so, viewed from that aspect, Guccifer 2.0 was, a useful way to deflect some of the attention. And those weaknesses are because it was done quickly, not as part of a really well thought out plan to disseminate these documents. And then there was also an interesting sort of French connection, if you will, between Guccifer 2.0 and Fancy Bear. And when we originally started this analysis, this was a relatively a very circumstantial part of the argument. We had identified that some of the C2 infrastructure for Fancy Bear, was France-based. Guccifer 2.0 is using a AOL French account, and his Twitter handle, he had tweets that had the language settings set to French, and a pattern of follows that suggested that the account was created from an IP that was located in France. Those are kind of interesting, odd little tidbits, but not necessarily, not really that compelling in the grand scheme of things compared to the entire weight of the evidence. But as this story has gained steam over the last several weeks, we've had several journalists, reach out to us to share some of their interactions that they've had with Guccifer 2.0 and ask for, some analytical assistance in interpreting some of them. And what we found was that Guccifer 2.0 AOL France email address that has been used to communicate with several journalists actually goes back to a VPN that's based in Russia. So again, maybe not the smoking gun that, this is definitive proof, but this is taken together the full body of evidence. This is getting stronger and stronger drumbeat that this actor is not independent, is not Romanian, has an increasingly clear tie to Russia. And so, we found that because really the French AOL account gives up the originating IP. And what we did, and this is a blog that we just published today on our website. So if you're interested in this, walking through the full technical analysis, it's there. But what we were able to do was walk back through the infrastructure from that originating French IP address to get to Elite VPN Services, which is a Russia-based VPN that IP originates from. All right, so we're in the last part of the quad chart now. Your analysis of competing hypotheses says you got to try to disprove each of your hypotheses. So we're trying to make the case now against Guccifer 2.0 as a DNC campaign. And again, we come back to one of the same points we made in hypothesis 1. Why inject so much doubt about the documents? The bears would have had access to the original unaltered documents, and their sock puppet would have made a much more compelling case and caused much more confusion about attribution if the documents were widely perceived as unaltered and therefore more legitimate. The other major point here against was actively influencing the American election very much changes the cost-benefit analysis from an espionage operation. When we started this, again, this was well before the WikiLeaks dump from this past weekend. We thought that was that was going into a different territory, and that manipulating the election risks retaliation. And given that this seemed so hastily constructed, that didn't seem to jive with potentially a huge game-changing shift in Russian calculus. All right, so basically, coming through this exercise, we found the strongest evidence for, Guccifer 2.0 is not an independent hacker. Stronger evidence that Guccifer 2.0 is a part of a DNC campaign than not. But like I said, the real strength of this method is trying to be able to disprove one of your hypotheses. And for us, we felt most comfortable coming out of this that Guccifer 2.0 was not an independent hacker, which leaves our other hypothesis that Guccifer 2.0 is in fact part of a Russian effort as our most likely. And, we debated this a lot in terms of what this meant on the team and what it meant going forward. And so, a couple of things that I'll walk through here. That assessment, let me take a step back. So, we assessed that Guccifer 2.0 is part of a Russian denial and deception operation. That has basically been our assessment since late June, and the subsequent statements and releases that he's made has not contravened that assessment. But that also draws out another assumption that we really have been wrestling with over the last several weeks. And this is what I just alluded to, in that we believe that Russia's hack into the DNC originally was not intended, in this manipulative fashion. That it was intended for espionage. And if this is the case, what we would expect to see is that you would see low-value information being leaked out over time. That Guccifer 2.0, was a propaganda outlet and a way to score, additional points. Propaganda sideshow, very little downside risk. And that was where we thought we were in our sort of steady state. Come up. So it seems to have some latency issues with the slides. So prior to the WikiLeaks disclosure, that's what we thought was going on. But the primary purposes of the DNC breach was espionage. Guccifer 2.0 is a propaganda sideshow with very little downside risk. He would continue to drip DNC documents out over time to a variety of media outlets. Those documents would be not super sensational, and most of the early documents before this last weekend's release fit that pattern. Old campaign finance scandals, lots of documents that highlighted the prominence of the LGBT community and their interactions with the DNC, either as donors or at attendees at events, things that were not politically sensational really in the U.S. And I think that's part of the reason why this story had been pretty quiet up until this past weekend. Those documents that Guccifer 2.0 was leaking just weren't that interesting to the U.S. audience. But that doesn't necessarily mean they can't also be used, at home in Russia. Indeed, we saw that RT, which is a state-backed, media outlet, picked up every single thing that Guccifer 2.0 has put out and amplified that message, of dirty money in politics, supporting it, and then, a very potent, virulent anti-homosexual theme that's very, unfortunately, common in today's Russia, in, naming LGBT donors, in those early releases. So what happened over the weekend started to move us towards this middle course of action, this game changer scenario. One of, Russia potentially seeking to influence the outcome of a U.S. election. This was a pretty widely debated scenario here within our team in terms of how likely we thought this was. We thought that to do this, Guccifer 2.0 would have to release documents that would have been used for much higher priority intelligence objectives. We thought it would be much closer to the election as a coup de grace to push late media coverage in a way that benefits Russia's desired outcome. If this scenario is part of the plan, we'd expect to see Guccifer 2.0, release higher quality documents and become a more trusted interlocutor with journalists. And so viewed that way, what happened over the weekend in terms of this huge dump of documents and the turmoil it caused in the immediate lead up to the DNC convention could put us on this path of, Guccifer 2.0 has certainly captured everyone's attention now with these documents, and these questions are coming up again in terms of, how credible are these documents? How credible is this interlocutor? And the big question, of course, is what else is there to come? We don't know to what extent that document dump, is the worst of what was exfiltrated from the DNC. And there's a very open question in terms of could that be more? Those of us on the team who thought the scenario was more likely, there was also a precedent here that was very concerning, and that pertained to Ukraine in 2014. And so what happened there, 3 days before the country headed to the polls, a really brazen three-pronged attack hit Ukraine's Central Election Commission. Which you can read about. It was published in the Wall Street Journal, Christian Science Monitor, but a group of pro-Russia hackers called Cyber Berkut rendered the country's vote tallying system inoperable and then spilled emails and other documents as proof of the breach. And then Ukrainian officials also discovered malware shortly before the results were scheduled to be announced that would have portrayed an ultra-nationalist who received less than 1% of the vote as the victor. So casting widespread doubt on the election's legitimacy overall. And so, that's a very concerning, very, very aggressive precedent. For our teammates that struggled and found that scenario less likely, as alarming as that precedent is, we looked at that as not necessarily being a valid indicator of what would happen here in the U.S., that Russia's ability to shape events in Ukraine is higher, and the risks of retaliation are much lower than attempting to sway the outcome of a U.S. election. What's going to, I think, be very interesting to see is, the reaction that this weekend's leaks bring. Certainly from a technical perspective, there would be no impediment to Guccifer 2.0, as this outlet for Russian intelligence to continue to leak more documents in the run-up to the election to try and sway the U.S. voting public one way or the other. Now we've moved into a realm of sort of more traditional geopolitics and political science. The game has shifted here into one where it's now a question of what are the implications of those actions, what retaliation do these actors potentially face, and that's not really one that we as ThreatConnect are here to talk about today. And then the final scenario is looking at the long game. How could Guccifer 2.0 and this whole experience be useful for other operations? And we looked at that in terms of, now that this persona has been established, Russia can use Guccifer 2.0 to release data from other attacks that have been attributed to Fancy Bear, Cozy Bear, or other Russian APTs. So claiming responsibility would once again help this persona be sort of the shiny object and help Russia in their attempt to change the media focus. We speculated, this was several weeks ago, that they would use Guccifer 2.0 to dump large amounts of data, which we saw over the weekend. But here, they're releasing compromised data that directly, impacts the media coverage that they're going for. We also think that outside of Guccifer 2.0 specifically, that this campaign has likely helped Russia refine some of its tactics. So future, denial deception campaigns leveraging hacktivist personas will most likely address some of the weaknesses that we've seen with Guccifer 2.0. Again, really dealing with the backstory, the use of technical language, the use of actual language. These are things that made it very easy, very quickly for the information security community and for journalists to figure out that this actor was not who he purported to be. And that we really needed to be cautious in dealing with, with handling his information and interacting with him directly. So that's basically the story. It's obviously still in progress, and again, I think it's going to be very interesting to see how this unfolds over the next few weeks. But I think the drivers at this point for how it will unfold are much more political than they are technical. We created here a list of the blogs, the research that we published on this story, on the DNC breach and on Lucifer 2.0. As I mentioned, these are all available on our website. And we're super excited to interact with you and talk with you about this subject. You can come see us at Black Hat next week. I will be present in the booth, as will numerous members of our research team. And let us know what you think. I think we've got some questions and answers now.
Yes, we do. And thanks, Toni, so much. I really appreciate that presentation. Some fascinating stuff there. And we will move on to the questions now. First question is, what questions related to Guccifer 2.0 haven't been answered yet?
I still think lots of questions haven't been answered yet. Some of the biggest remaining really pertain to the scale of the WikiLeaks dump over the weekend. I think there are a lot of very valid questions about the integrity of those documents. And I think part of it's just sort of in the scale of that release that prevented us from fully digging into that. And then there are still lots of questions sort of, about this persona. I mean, we can keep picking at the inconsistencies because we're pretty sure he's not who he says he is. But of course, at the end of the day, you're still making an assessment based on the strength of the evidence and tying this to Russia. I'm sure everyone would love, a smoking gun.
Sure. Next question. So if Guccifer is not a single actor and they're looking to sabotage the U.S. election, why isn't the effort more cohesive?
Well, that's an excellent question. I think for us, this really comes back to that this was not part of the preordained, the original operation. That this was hastily constructed, and also it would suggest to us that the operators of the Guccifer 2.0 persona are not the technical experts themselves that breached the DNC. You're looking potentially at a different part of the bureaucracy, the the information operations guys or the propaganda guys that, you know, don't necessarily have the same technical credibility as these very sophisticated actors, you know, who have been breaching these networks. And so to us, that is an explanation for, you know, why you see these inconsistencies, both again in terms of the technical claims, but then also then just across Guccifer's own statements and the tone and you know, and the style of speaking. That you got a lot of cooks in this kitchen here, not just one actor.
Gotcha. And moving on to the next question, what were some of the sticking points in your research, and how were those overcome? Sure.
So part of the sticking points in the research here, you know, really dealt with just how fragmented the data was. You know, CrowdStrike did this really amazing forensic analysis, but then when you want to go in and start digging into that, you know, to those indicators, you're leveraging a lot of different services. And so for us, you know, having ThreatConnect as a platform for us is an ace up our sleeve in terms of our ability to do this work quickly and efficiently and not have 8,000 windows open at the same time. But then also it was, you know, a big part of it was gaining access to additional data. And as we started to publish our research on this, you know, and engage with journalists who were directly talking to Guccifer 2.0, you know, people became more willing to share some of that insight with us that would allow us to validate what they were seeing or, you know, cause doubt in the credibility of that actor.
All right, and I got another question here. Do you think that Guccifer 2.0 will continue to be a story in the near future?
Well, certainly you will, I think, for the next, you know, next week or so. I hope that Guccifer 2.0 stops being a story in the run-up to this election. Because the longer, you know, this is a story, the greater the questions are about the role of a foreign power, you know, meddling with our democratic processes. And that's something that should be concerning, I'd say, no matter what part of the political spectrum that you find yourself on. And so I certainly hope that, you know, this fades away.
Sure. Still have a few minutes left here. Here's another question. Will you be sharing any suggested solutions to protect against these kinds of intrusions and this intrusion technology that's been used?
Sure. I mean, we're certainly happy to talk about, you know, how we as ThreatConnect and the threat intelligence platform sort of fit into that security landscape, and, you know, allowing organizations to bring their people, their processes, and their technologies together, you know, behind a unified platform, you know, that allows an organization to leverage these types of insights in a proactive manner to defend their networks.
All right, great. And let's see, here's, maybe we have time for a super quick, simple one. How about the slides for these presentations? You plan on making them available?
Yes, if anybody would like the slides, please just email our team at marketing@threatconnect.com. They'd be happy to provide them to you. And like I said, if any of our listeners here are going to be attending Black Hat or DEF CON, please come reach out to us. Our research team will be there in full force. You can come hang out with us at booth 148. We'll buy you a drink. And, you know, sign up for a free account on ThreatConnect.com and go check out the data for yourself and kick the tires.
All right, sounds great. And with that, today's session has concluded. I want to once again thank Toni Gidwani for being with us today, and of course, thanks to everyone for tuning in. As a reminder, this webcast will be available on demand beginning tomorrow on the SE Magazine website under the Events tab. For SE Magazine, this is Bradley Barth. Have a safe day online.